And the stories that I've uncovered since then have been so fulfilling to understand who my grandpa was, the role that he played in my life, who my grandma is, and how she became who she is. And then so many other people who came before that made major sacrifices to get me to where I am today.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. In case you haven't figured it out yet, I love chatting with my coworkers from Ancestry about family history. It is something that we do here in the podcast studio as often as I can get one of them in here, but it is also something that we do in the office. And one of the people that I love seeing headed for my desk is Jordan Lundskog. Now, we've worked together for a few years, and he is a product manager whose responsibilities are specifically for the memories section of the Ancestry family trees. That's the place where you upload your photos and your stories and attach them to the people and recognize who those ancestors are to start to build out a really rich family history and preserve it on Ancestry. As the product manager responsible for that portion of the whole Ancestry experience, Jordan has had some really great interactions with customers and some really great stories that he's collected, but none of those stories are more important than his own. Now, Jordan's a young father with some young children. You'll hear him talk about them a little bit. But one of the things that he talks about in this episode quite a bit is his grandfather. His grandfather passed away when he was a teenager, and he was really close with him. But in the ensuing years, he's actually grown closer to his grandfather because of the stories that he's uncovered and because of the way that he serves as a bridge between generations, making sure that his children know the stories of their ancestors, and in particular, that grandfather of his. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jordan Lundskog. Okay, well, Jordan, how long have you and I worked together?
I've been at Ancestry for 6 years. I think we've worked together for about 4 of those 6 years.
Okay, fantastic. Well, tell me a little bit about why Ancestry. Like, is there something that drew you to the company? Was it more about your particular career path, or was there something about Ancestry in particular?
Funny enough, a recruiter called me. Ancestry wasn't on my radar. And as soon as they called, I couldn't say no because it's a Utah original, and it's a brand that just really brings families together. I think the mission is fun. I didn't know that's what I was looking for, but the mission is fun. And then there's such a unique set of challenges that we face as we're helping people capture their family stories. So I think that's what keeps me coming every day, is finding new ways to use technology to help people find their stories, tell their stories, and connect to their families.
Yeah. So are you also a Utah original?
My family is from here. I was born in Alabama because my dad was working out of state, but yeah, I've got deep roots here in Utah.
On both sides?
On both sides, yeah.
Okay.
On my mom's side, they were founding members of Midway up in Wasatch County.
Are they Swiss?
They weren't Swiss, funny enough. They were, they came straight from England and Ireland. So they were a couple of the non-Swiss folks that snuck in there and got accepted. Then on my dad's side, I have folks who came across on the Mayflower. And then my great-grandpa came straight from Switzerland to Salt Lake Valley. So everyone's like here, but yeah, Utah roots all the way around.
That. So was that stuff you knew before you started working at Ancestry, or is this all information that has come to light since your job? Funny enough,
I knew a lot of it because my great-grandma was heavily involved in the Utah pioneers up in Wasatch County. Funny enough, though, she was on my grandma's side, and she was a transplant. So everyone else, she was really focused on preserving family stories, but as a transplant from California, where the rest of the family was from the Valley. When I really dug in and got to know the characters, that was the biggest part, is knowing the characters in my tree and then being able to connect the dots and the stories and the experiences they had. That's what really, I think, broke through and connected everything for me.
Yeah. So were you raised in a family environment with reunions or family stories being told by grandma and grandpa or pictures being brought out and you just didn't pay attention? Or was that not a part of your family culture?
I think there were some stories that came up, but they come up a lot more when I know the right things to ask. So yeah, stories came up, but one of the stories we could talk about a little bit later that just blew my mind. I had a second great grandfather who had an accident up in the mountains above Camas. He dropped a gun. First time it just fell out of his holster and he picked it back up as they were setting up the tent. The second time he dropped it, it hit a rock and shot him straight through the heart and just killed him. I'd never heard that story before. That story existed in my family, but I'd never heard it. And then as I was able to talk through my family, they were aware of it. And it's interesting to see how that defined that branch of my family where my second great grandma was 30, had 3 kids and had to figure out how to raise her family. And just, it was interesting to hear about how that affected her personality and who she was as a human. So stories would come up, but I think they come up a lot more now that I know who to ask about and trying to fill in those gaps where, one of the things, I think one of the other things that's been really interesting at Ancestry, I worked on a product called We Remember, where we capture memories of people that passed away. And for whatever reason, that started to click in my mind that we don't have forever to capture these stories. And so I'm down to one grandma now. And so capturing as much as I can of that line, even though I'm not a pro-genealogist, I don't know who else is going to do it. So I got to capture that. I got to make sure the photos are kept for future because my kids love hearing those types of things. I've got to make sure that my kids have those stories to pass on. But it's so fascinating how they latch on to stories because I've mentioned them about the Mayflowers. We celebrate Thanksgiving and they've latched onto that. Hey, remember great-great-great-grandpa was a part of that? Or we talk about the Civil War or some of the other conflicts, the Revolutionary War. There's a few ancestors that kind of fit in there. Or my grandpa served during the Korean conflict. And it's just so fascinating how they latch on and start to identify with that. And it's been fun to jump into my wife's side too. And she's got a rich family history as well, but start to understand who are the characters in her family and help my kids just really understand who are they? They've come from people who've done hard things and make sure that's built into their DNA because the world's not going to tell them that. So it's anytime I can get a picture and show them or kind of just tell them a little story on the table, it's a lot of fun to just connect the dots.
Yeah, it is. And now as you're making that intentional choice to make that a part of your family culture, this urgency that you feel to collect those stories from elsewhere in the family, that becomes a really tangible thing. And, there's so many stories and so much to collect and we don't know how much time we have. And so what is kind of the mechanism that you're using for doing that? I mean, Ancestry, obviously, but do you have a routine? Do you have a plan at all?
Oh, I feel a little guilty because I work in this space and I understand how psychology works. For most of our users, if there's somebody passes away, for most people, they have 7 to 10 days to act on that, to make progress, to keep that urgency moving forward. My other grandma passed away this last December, and I have all these great intentions of things that I'm going to be supposedly doing, but we're sitting here in August and I've made minimal progress. So I wish I had a better plan. I try to spend a little time each week to document some of the stories I've captured, make sure the photos that I've gotten access to are linked to people. That's the most important thing. If you can connect to who is in a photo or who is in a story, and then I try to make those accessible to as many people as possible. So I have a public tree on Ancestry to make that accessible to folks in Family Search, because that's an easy place for a lot of people to go and dig into. I would love to, I'm working towards recreating scrapbooks or photo albums in something that's more similar to chapbooks. It's just a little coffee table 8x8 book that can just be handed out or gifted to different folks in the family. So that's what I'm working towards. But most of my stuff currently lives in the structure of a tree, either on Ancestry or Family Search.
Which is good because it preserves it and it makes sure that it's accessible, like you mentioned. Your grandma that passed away recently, was she your dad's side or mom's side?
On my dad's side.
And is your dad also interested, or are you kind of the one who's carrying that torch?
I think there's a little more interest now. on that side of the family, they were always telling stories and I just wasn't interested. Now that I'm like thinking more deeply about it, and it breaks my heart now, but there's just like that side of the family, we'd also have family reunions and we'd go sit down and watch slides. And I didn't understand what slides were for the first time. So I was so excited as a kid. I'm like, I don't know what watching slides is, but that sounds awesome. And then we sat down and it was these poorly colored photos that didn't move. But that is probably what I want to spend the most time figuring out how to digitize, either, using just getting something good enough to make sure that it doesn't get lost. If I wait forever, I could pay thousands of dollars and figure that out, but that's just not going to happen. So trying to find the best way to preserve those slides so we can pass them on because they're so rich. We just scanned 50 of them for the video to play at her funeral. And like the stories that just come out when you just show a single photo, like 1,000 words is an understatement because it's 1,000 words from each person who has their own perspective of that given photo. So my dad, he's got boxes of photos that we're going to be working on scanning together and knock it out together.
Yeah, I love that. That idea of a photo as a spark of a memory is something that we've used in my family for a really long time. But what you just shared about how then, everybody has a perspective of that event or that story or that person in that photo. And that then becomes this repository of things that you can connect to that photo that gives you this complete picture of who they are. Because what I've discovered in my family stories is oftentimes I'm looking at it from a single perspective. Like I have a memory of that person or that event, or they shared their words and that's all I have left is their words and their perspective of that event. So whenever you can get that 360 view of a whole person, I think that's such a beautiful thing. And photos are a really great way to do that. So in your family, as you've now kind of embarked on this family history journey, it sounds like you're becoming the keeper of all the things. There's always one.
Not on purpose. It just kind of happened that way. It's funny because you and I talked about this in the office the other day, but when I was 16, my grandpa passed away suddenly, and it was right around my birthday. This was my mom's dad. So it was right around Thanksgiving, and I was the last cousin who got to see him in the hospital before things just went downhill after that. And I didn't really understand, that was a triggering event for me. First time someone close to me had passed away. But all these years later, that is my driving force for why I care, because I only got 16 years with my grandpa. And so I owe it to my kids to know who my grandpa was and the role that he played in my life and in their life. And it's just, I don't know that I ever would have dreamed that I would end up at Ancestry working on building tools and focusing on helping other people to do the exact same thing. But that's why I care. And the stories that I've uncovered since then have been so fulfilling to understand who my grandpa was, the role that he played in my life, who my grandma is, and how she became who she is. And then so many other people who came before that made major sacrifices to get me to where I am today. It's unreal when you dig deep and understand who you're from and where you're from and how you're from. It's pretty humbling to dig into those types of experiences.
Yeah. Before you started learning more about your grandpa's life, is there some memory from your childhood about him that is when you think of him, this is what you think of?
Oh, he was a diehard Cougar fan. So it was, watching a Cougar game with him was just entertainment galore. Regardless how the game was going on TV. I also have a very distinct memory that I couldn't live down. When I was 4 years old, we were moving back from Texas. My grandpa flew out to help us and drove back in the moving truck with us. And anytime I would ever meet any of his friends or anybody, a stranger, whatever, he would tell the story of little Jordan when he was 4 years old, leaving Texas with tears in his eyes, telling grandpa he didn't have a friend in the world. So those are two or three things that I always remember. And he was always whistling too. He always was just whistling some song. So there's two or three things like that even today, anytime I catch myself whistling a song, it just takes me right back to remembering grandpa.
I love that. So since then, now you're an adult, you have children of your own, and you've been seeking to understand him better. Are there stories that have come out? Do you have any favorite stories about him that you didn't know before?
So the week before I started at Ancestry, I didn't know newspapers.com existed before then. but I got access to newspapers.com. And so I just put in LeVar Wild to see what I could find. And I found a high school photo of him playing football. I knew he played sports. I knew he loved that, but I'd never seen a photo of that. And so there's the caption, his name at the bottom of him playing for South Summit High School against Tooele. I sent that to my mom. I sent that to my grandma, and it just went like mini viral within my family because nobody else had ever seen any documentation of him playing sports in high school. So that was the first discovery that I think really clicked for me. And then all of a sudden, all these other papers and documents and things started coming out. My grandma had the presence of mind 4 years before my grandpa passed. He had another scare with his heart. So she started documenting his history with him. And these documents had existed for a while and I'd never just asked about them. So I dug in and digitized them. And it was so interesting to just read through his whole life. One thing that really stuck out to me was when he joined the army to fight in the Korean conflict. He was stationed in San Francisco, which we happen to have an office in San Francisco. I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know this until 3 years ago, but there's a military scrapbook of all the photos of his time at boot camp. And he ended up being stationed in Germany with the 501 transport unit. But I found pictures of my grandpa standing right in front of the Bay Bridge, in front of like the Bay Area, where I'd been there a handful of times with our Ancestry office. And one of the sweetest moments I've had at Ancestry was being able to go back and recreate some of those photos, standing in the exact same spot where he likely stood. And obviously the city looks different, but there's just something about being in the same place as your ancestor. So it was interesting to kind of step into a couple of those spots and just stand where he stood. And then there's just funny like newspaper articles where I learned about his Eagle Scout project. I learned about how he like broke his ankle one time running through a field. I learned about his favorite car that was, I think, green, that he bought when he was younger. It's been so fascinating to get to know him in like different phases of life that I've already been through and kind of connect on that basis. I think it's been a really fascinating experience, but the newspaper articles have really like spurred so many conversations and spurred, oh yeah, we probably have a photo of that, or here's the other details you don't have about that. So it's been interesting to just kind of see, like going back to your 360, the photos are powerful. The newspaper articles, the written documented stories are so powerful, but I don't have it all sitting in a family book. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I like box this up and make this something meaningful that my siblings will care about, my mom and her siblings will care about, and my kids can identify with and care about. There's
this interesting thing about the process of discovery, right? So as you've been going on this journey, you've made these discoveries about your grandfather, which have given him a whole new dimension for you. And it's interesting to hear you talk about, how do I then package that up to share it? And so my question is always, and I struggle with this for myself, like I want to do the same thing. I want to share these discoveries with my family members, but I wonder if it will be as meaningful for them to just have it packaged up and handed to them, or if somehow we need to figure out a way to help them go on that same journey of discovery for themselves.
That's such a deep question, because that's one of the trickiest parts. You see the Ancestry commercial and you're like, oh, cool, I can go figure out if I'm related to George Washington. But there's a price you pay to get there to really understand that. And you get what you pay for. So the stories are valuable, but it can be a lonely journey if they don't, like the rest of the family doesn't fully understand who these people are. Two of the things two of the most impactful experiences I've had is playing with technology and trying to just create ways for people to just kind of browse and explore who an individual was and kind of connect the dots on their own. The most impactful though, I wasn't prepared for this, but last year as Apple was working on their VR headset, we went out and spent some time kind of exploring what we could do with it. And there was something about blowing up a photo to full life size in that like high quality environment where it felt like I was literally staring into my grandpa's eyes in a way I haven't done in 20 years, that I think can introduce people to our ancestors in a way that takes maybe a little bit less effort, if that makes sense. I remember specifically looking at a photo where I was 8 years old. My grandpa was standing right behind me. And it was funny to look into my own 8-year-old eyes, as I have an 8-year-old at home, but then to look just like I didn't have a growth spurt till after my grandpa passed. So being able to look eye to eye into my grandpa's eyes for the first time in 20 years was like, it felt so silly to be standing there with a Vision Pro on my forehead and tears streaming down my cheek, just like stepping back in time almost. So I'm really excited about the role that technology can play in like an AR and a VR perspective that doesn't require you to be an expert, but I think there will be some of these experiences that allow us to step into rich environments that can help people get up to speed faster than the years it can take to really get to know some of our ancestors.
Yeah, that's the possibilities are so exciting, and yet it still requires somebody to be willing to step into that space. And Ancestry has done studies that show that over 50% of Americans can't even name all 4 of their grandparents. And so for you, that was an emotional experience because you already had a relationship with him. But when you start to get back further, or when you start to consider there are people who don't know those people, that kind of changes, I think, a little bit that process of discovery. So the connection has to be made. There has to be an emotional connection, I think, before people are willing to go on that journey. And it's always interesting to me to see what sparks that in different people. For you, it was the loss of your grandfather at 16. For me, it was having a grandfather I never even knew because he died when my mom was 17, right? And that being pulled into that. And then a grandfather who, another grandfather who, he never knew his grandmother or anything about her life. And he craved that knowledge. And when he figured out I had some skills in figuring some of those things out, he set me on this path of like, go figure this out, go find this for me. And so there's, I think, that curiosity and that need for connection that spurs people on into this journey. And again, like we can package that up and give that to people, but there's something about being in that journey that fosters that connection. And so I love that we get to figure out different ways. You get to figure out.
I think we're figuring it out together. And I think just making it as like human as possible. I think the tree is the pedigree is a really powerful tool as like a map, but it can't be the way that people get to know their family. The dates and the names, everyone's got them, right? Everyone's born, everyone dies, marriage happens, but that's not who our people are. So if we can find a way to incorporate I don't even know the right voice to use, but just talking to them, talking about them as if we knew them or as if they still exist, I think is a really powerful way to just start to connect the dots, because the dates and the pedigree is what put me to sleep for years, that I just thought, oh, my work's all done. Like family tree's built back forever, but it's not. There's more gaps in my tree that I needed to come to Ancestry to kind of like understand and kind of dig into and get a little bit deeper on. And like you said, there's these individuals who I didn't even know existed before I came to Ancestry. And apart from preserving my grandpa's story, these other ancestors have become my like focal point. How do I learn everything I can about these people, connect the dots, and make sure that their legacy lives on? Because there's only 2 or 3 people that even knew they existed at this point.
Yeah. So do you have a favorite, 1 or 2? Tell us about them.
So yeah, this has been like a 2.5 year journey. So it's just talking about like the time it takes sometime to make some of these discoveries. James Knott Polk McGee is my 5th great grandpa. He grew up in Missouri and was a Civil War vet, but being from Missouri, he chose to fight for the Union. This is where it gets interesting, because I had someone reach out on Ancestry from Missouri, last name McGee. I'd never met before. And that's a line that we just don't have a lot of information about. And he said, hey, I think we're looking at the same line. I have this photo in this old family Bible that I think might be our 5th great grandmother. Her name was Sophronia America Peak. And that's where, like, so fascinating back and forth as I've talked with William McGee, this member of Ancestry, we started to piece together some of these items that I couldn't find anywhere else. Census record had limited information, but he found like a family book. It was like Pike County people, places, and something else. And he sent me 3 or 4 pages that documented who James Knott McGee was, who he fought for in the Civil War. He had 3 wives because the first 2 passed away in childbirth at some point. Anyway, just started unlocking all these fascinating things. And then my grandma gave me a thumb drive that had 1,000 photos on it. I wanted to know who James Knott McGee was. A cousin of mine years ago had the presence of mind to just scan a bunch of shoe boxes all together and get them digitized, and they've been sitting on a thumb drive. And last year I found a photo of James Knott Polk McGee. Now, the reason he really is important to me is he was a dead end for a long time in my tree. Legend has it that he chose to fight for the Union and was disowned from his family, had some disagreements. So he changed the spelling of McGee from MCGEE to MAGEE, which created some fun challenges and conflicts as we're like digging back into the tree. But the fact that he had the courage to stand up for what he believed in, even if family didn't, has just had so much impact on me. And the photo I found is him older. He's standing in front of, he's got his dog in front of him, and this dog's got like a top hat on. And I just cannot stop digging in to like learn more about who he was. One other treasure that my grandma had, she had a box of a few other things. She had a handwritten note that he wrote to his son, who was living in California at the time, just checking in on him, saying, "Hey, we miss you. Hope you're doing well. Here's kind of what's going on with our family." There's like no punctuation at all throughout the whole thing. But it was unreal to see a handwritten note from a Civil War vet who had a massive impact on my family. So I made sure to digitize that, transcribe it, gave it back to my grandma so she has the original document. But just piecing together these different pieces from a family book that someone had the presence of mind to write as a community, having a photo, having a handwritten note, just really starts to craft like who was James Knott Polk McGee, who lived a long time before I was born, but like he is one of my all-time favorite family tree members. And my kids too, they've latched on to, hey, remember we had that guy who fought in the Civil War. They don't know his name yet, but they remember that we've talked about the story and how he had the courage to stand up and go against the grain in a time that like, that was huge.
Yeah. Especially in that particular place.
Yeah. In that particular place. And so, and the other thing that's funny, like I remember watching the Titans, and they talk about Gettysburg, and it was brother against brother. And I kind of just like would always just smirk at that. And I never really fully understood that. But in my family tree, there very much is that possibility that it could have been brother against brother standing up for what they believed in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because we talk about history, and as kids, you know, your kids now going through grade school, like they're learning things that seem so abstract, but yet we're so impactful on our country and on the culture that we live in today. And when you start to finally come to that realization that people you are connected to were intimately involved in those experiences, it changes your perspective of those experiences. The Civil War becomes not just this abstract thing. It becomes something that is part of your DNA. The Revolutionary War becomes something part of your DNA. I have two grandfathers who both fought in World War II. That is not just an abstract thing for me. As I listened to my grandmother recount the stories that my grandfather shared with her, or read the diary that my other grandfather kept during the war, those become very real experiences. And I think that matters, because all of those things are what help shape our communities, our country, our world, and understanding them at a really personal level, and the personal costs and the personal choices that people made, that I think that connects us and helps us realize that the choices we make today matter for the future.
Yeah, that's deep.
So you have this Missouri McGee connection to the Civil War. You've talked about your grandfather and your connection to him and the path that set you on. Is there one or two more, any other ancestors that stand out that you think these are the stories I want to make sure that I tell and continue to tell?
On my dad's side, the Lundskog, which is where I get my Swedish from, like 40% Swedish. My second great grandpa came from Sweden. His son, Gustav, was in Sweden, and then he called for him to come when he was 10 years old, and he came by himself from Sweden, and he was supposed to meet a cousin in New York. I don't know how he did that. Like, I don't know how he left Sweden, not speaking any English, met a cousin in New York, and then made his way to Salt Lake City to finally see his dad after a number of years when he got here, he just locked in and did everything he could to learn the language, work hard, start a family. My dad didn't even know him because he passed, I think, when my dad was just a kid or even younger. Maybe it was before he was even born. I'm trying to remember. But he had the courage to stand up, come here. If he would have said no or would have got lost or anything along the way, my story becomes something completely different. But because he made it all the way to Salt Lake, my story happened. But it's I don't know enough about my Swedish roots yet. So there's a lot of work still to do there. I don't speak Swedish, which is tricky. But my biggest regret is because my grandpa went back and served a mission in Sweden and met family. I wish I would have dug in and spent a little more time talking to him and understanding the language a little bit more and who are these people and how is the connecting tissue work with that. He would sometimes, he couldn't stop laughing, but my grandpa would sometimes sing happy birthday in Swedish. He didn't have a lot of Swedish left he could remember, but he would always just laugh so hard trying to sing happy birthday to you in Swedish. So I think that just like, I can't imagine sending my 10-year-old from like doing the reverse. If I send him from here to Sweden and hope that he meets his cousin or something, like that is just wild. And he has a cell phone.
And there's airplanes.
And there's all these other things.
You're still not sending him alone.
Yeah, I'm still not going to send him alone. So it was unreal to just see that he was able to do that and like just lock in and focus on life after that. That's I don't know. That one's touched my heart, but I need to learn a little bit more about his story and his experience. Yeah.
Well, and that what you've just illustrated really beautifully is this idea that there are little things in our family stories that trigger connection. Like this father who sends away for his 10-year-old son to come halfway across the world by himself, and you looking at that as a father and thinking, what on earth? But then also just recognizing that child had to have that courage to come and go through that whole experience as well. And now you want to know more, probably about both of them.
Well, yeah, because I'm trying to teach my 9 and 10-year-old how to be resilient, or my 8 and 10-year-old how to be resilient and how to do hard things. And that, like, I don't need to send them across the world to figure that out, but there are definitely little building blocks that help them kind of retain. I can only imagine that my great grandpa, like anything after that would have been easy. If you think about like anything else he was asked to do in life, trying to find a job, learn a language, any of those other, like he made it across the world and made it alive. So just anything was easy after that.
That's amazing. You bring up a really good point too, which is the resilience that we gain. It's not just about perspective. It's not just about connection. There is something to be said for knowing that if they did hard things, we can do hard things too. And for me, that is one of the reasons that I continue to share family stories with my nephews and my niece. That's the reason I continue to share them, even with my siblings, wherever they are in their stage in life, because something about knowing that is in us is so empowering. And so I love that you have that perspective as well. Well, I think I love this arc of family history experience that you've had and the journey that these individual stories have taken you on as you think kind of collectively, and you've touched on it a little bit, but as you think collectively about your family history experience and how you're trying to transmit it to your children, what is your hope for the future for them?
I hope that they recognize who they are and the sacrifices that people made, and that they'll make choices that make themselves proud and make their family who's living and the ancestors proud of the legacy that they're defining. And I hope that when they're going through something hard, they'll remember that they've had a lot of other people who made it through hard things that are cheering them on, pushing them on. I hope they'll always be curious, just like ask the questions, try to understand more about who they are, where they came from, and who they can become.
Well, your curiosity, I'm sure, will spark some of that. And certainly it is blessing a whole lot of Ancestry customers. So thank you for sharing your story and for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.